So the hardest thing to do, really, is to decide where exactly you start somebody with Star Wars. Now, this debate's been raging for years. It used to be incredibly easy. You and I grew up with Star Wars, and it was like, you watched the first 3, then the prequels came out, and they got a little muddier. Rogue One came out last year, and now the conversation is considerably more difficult. I've started reading theories that for people who have never seen a Star Wars movie, the first one you should show them is Star Wars Rogue One, or Rogue One, A Star Wars Story.
That's not a good idea at all.
It's very bizarre. So here's the justification behind it that I'm hearing from people. Canonically, it takes place before A New Hope, which is the start of the most important and best Star Wars trilogy. I think that's pretty undebatable. And it leads you right into that story, and it enhances that story for everybody else. The reason I disagree with that, or 2 reasons I disagree with that mainly, is number one, Rogue One is full of Easter eggs and references that I think more devout Star Wars fans will understand better.
I think the best comparison would be if you've never had a beer before.
Yeah.
And you've never had a beer, and you've got a friend who's like a huge beer snob, and he's like, oh, you've got to try this oatmeal porter stout. It's from a small batch brewer, and you're like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know what any of these, like, just baby steps, you know? Like, work your way up. Like, maybe have like just a crappy beer and figure it out from there.
And number 2 is that while Rogue One did a great job of setting up A New Hope stands on its own. You know how I know that? Because that's what it did for like 40 years.
Yeah.
Like, it's cool that we have backstory now that explains like sentences and throwaway lines and showing us the struggle that took to get where we are. But I understood that the Death Star had a flaw in it because I saw A New Hope when I was like 7, and I got it, I figured it out.
Yeah, so I have a friend who I exposed to the Star Wars movies, and she didn't understand who Darth Vader was as a character until she watched the original trilogy. And she just assumed that he was kind of like a dumb supervillain type guy who just come in and kill people and just be bad. But then she's like, oh wait, he's got like a nuanced, deep story, and that's why they made 3 prequels explaining him as he is.
Yeah.
If you show Rogue One and Darth Vader shows up, you have no idea who he is, and it makes no sense.
It's so true. Like, it's also like he shows up at the end of Rogue One. We're not going to spoil anything here, but he has a scene at the end of Rogue One, if you haven't seen it yet, where he comes off more of like a horror movie villain than he does like a nefarious and calculated military general, which I think he spends most of the original trilogy doing. Second thing, let's talk about the other approach that people have taken is this weird thing called machete order.
Right.
And I understand it. The way it goes is like this. You watch A New Hope, you watch Empire Strikes Back, the first 2 Star Wars movies released, and then you pause the trilogy, and you go back and you watch 1, 2, and 3.
Or you can skip 1 and just do 2 and 3.
So basically, Luke finds out that Darth Vader's his father. You go, who is this guy? Flashback, here's the whole sequence. That's, to me, needlessly confusing as well. I describe it, since you went with the beer reference before, I describe it as like listening to a bunch of classical music and then pausing the CD in the middle to listen to a bunch of like, I don't know, DJ Tiesto remixes of classical music. Like, it feels weird.
Yeah.
Like, it's still classical music, but it's like a totally different take on it. So, here we are where we are in this long walk, because this is a long walk, to get exactly where Max and I have determined the definitive order of Star Wars movie watching should be, and you're totally free to disagree. It's totally okay.
Well, let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, number 1, A New Hope.
Easy start.
Obviously, it's the first Star Wars movie. Just watch it. It introduces everything. It's the way it's meant to be. It's not going to scare anybody off. It's a really good movie. It holds up incredibly well.
Yeah, both on a story, narrative level, technical levels, CG, all that kind of stuff, or lack thereof. Holds up really well.
And then following that, you do it the way you're supposed to do it. Star Wars: The Holiday Special.
That's right.
No, I'm just kidding. Empire Strikes Back, obviously. It's the perfect follow-up to A New Hope. Just, that's how it goes. You have to do it. Anybody who watches that out of order from there is a lunatic, or you're probably the way we watched it, actually going to video stores in the early 90s.
Yeah, I think I saw Jedi first as a kid, so it confused me.
I watched out of order on USA or something. Anyway, and then of course Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
Machete Order is cool, but I think it really, you've got momentum with the original trilogy, and you learn to appreciate these characters. Now this next one is kind of a crazy ball. Is that a sports term? I don't know. We're talking about Star Wars. Who cares?
Yes.
The Force Awakens.
Force Awakens. Now hear me out. You're probably like, but what a huge jump it is from Jedi to Force Awakens. Yes, but what a huge jump it is from Empire to Jedi. When we leave Luke Skywalker in Empire, he's lost a hand and found that his father is an evil robot man. It sucks. When you find him in Jedi, he invades a drug dealer's house in a robe, and he's like insanely powerful, and all this crazy stuff goes on, and he has to fight like this giant turd monster in the basement.
Now, bear in mind, this order of viewing might change in a matter of months because there's going to be suddenly a different follow-up to 7. We don't know where that's going. It might be relying heavily on stuff that happens in prequels. Who knows? But I think that it also makes sense because it is familiar characters, and it's being like, the prequels have a problem with having too many familiar characters, but in like almost like a where were they in high school kind of way. Whereas this is like, what happens next? And up until 2 years ago, we didn't know what happened next. So it's kind of like,
it's following the same thread from the original trilogy onward.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the theme here.
Again, if you're exposing somebody to Star Wars movies for the first time and you're on like a time crunch, or maybe you have to put aside a number of weekends to do this, getting through 4 movies is a lot easier than getting through 8 movies. So you can still take them to see Episode 8 when it comes out this fall, right? Makes sense.
Yeah.
So they'll be caught up and they'll kind of know what's going on. Now, next up, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
See, now it gets crazy, because here's my logic on this. You've just showed somebody 4 Star Wars movies. They're in. If they haven't left you or broken up with you or stopped being your friends, they are locked into this franchise and they love it now. Now, you can start to give them needless backstory, which Phantom Menace has in spades. Why do we say that? Phantom Menace is obviously the one of the original trilogy, or the prequel trilogy, that is sort of like the one that even Machete Order people can gloss over, right? It doesn't really have a ton of stuff that adds...
it introduces you to Jedi Knights as being part of this larger organization. You get to see the Senate. You get kind of a sense of like, oh, Palpatine wasn't always a bad guy. And
young Obi-Wan is super cool.
Yeah, Ewan McGregor's great. It's also just like, I would say, kind of on the same level as the original trilogy and the newer movies. It's the same amount of CG and practical effects. Like, it's pretty. There's a lot of CG in there, but it's also like, it's not quite as beating you over the head with it as you will get with 2 and 3.
You're totally right. I didn't even think about that. There's a ton of practical effects and sets and props in Phantom Menace, so that's a good transition into the sort of newer era.
Now, next, Attack of the Clones.
You're in. You're doing the prequel trilogy now.
Sorry, you got to do it.
Flying through it. This is what you wanted, isn't it?
Yep.
And if you wanted your friend to be a Star Wars fan.
And if they're like really on board, then of course you can do I don't know, you can do Clone Wars or whatever.
Yeah.
But then of course there's Revenge of the Sith.
Yep.
Which you'd level as Attack of the Clones, whatever.
So if you're following so far, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, and finally, Rogue One.
Yep.
Full circle, right? So now that you've learned everything, this Rogue One does a good job of sort of like bridging that prequel stuff with the newer stuff, with CG, with storytelling, all those things. And it's very much standalone.
Yep.
So I think that makes perfect sense. And by now, you are so enriched by Star Wars history that what can you do? Go back to the start.
Yeah.
Go back to Episode 4. So re-loop your trilogy. You want to go to the next slide?
Oh, all right, well, next one, just watch A New Hope again. Yeah. Just go back full circle.
Go back, watch A New Hope. You're done. You watched the video, but I bet you want more. If you're not thoroughly confused by our Star Wars timeline, maybe you'll be able to consume the X-Men timeline. We broke a video down for you right here, so check it out. After that, if you got some money to spend, how about $600 on a C-3PO toy? This is the one to buy. All that and more every week, every Thursday, every noon, specifically on Thursdays at noon on IGN, YouTube, and Twitch.